Cole, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Wilson Cole. Wilson founded Adams, Evans & Ross more than 2 decades ago. The company has grown into the nation's largest credit and collection company exclusively for the staffing and recruiting industries. Wilson's company has helped over 3,000 staffing and recruiting firms collect over $1 billion in past due debt. Wilson also happens to be my wonderful dad, so this is a very special interview for me. And without further ado, let's jump into it. How did you get into collections?
Well, Allie, that's a great question. This is what I've done for 28, 29 years. Actually, I take that back. I've done Adams, Evans & Ross for 28 years. I've been in collections for about 30 years. And I had worked for a company as their VP of operations and their head of sales, and we were doing commercial collections. I've never done the consumer collections, and it sounds like it should be apples to apples, but it's really just worlds apart because you're dealing with companies versus dealing with the individual. So it's not as emotional and mentally draining, in my opinion. It's also much more effective. On commercial collections, you typically have about an 80% success rate, where on consumers, a good success rate's roughly about 20, 30%. But I got into this industry probably about 30 years ago. We got solely into staffing about 27 years ago, where when I first started out, we were based out of Atlanta, and we were doing collections for a lot of computer companies back then, but then we ran into a couple of staffing and recruiting clients and realized that paper collected so much better, because if you're selling computers and you don't pay for your motherboards, you're out of business. You have no product to sell. But if you are putting together computers and you've had a whole bunch of temporaries over there, if you don't pay, if you have a cash crunch, that temporary bill is going to be one of the first bills that you don't pay, because if the staffing or recruiting firm cuts you off, they just jump to another staffing or recruiting firm. So it's a third tier debt. It's one of the first debts not to get paid as a general rule. And so we found out that it was a paper that collected better than most. And over the last 26, 27 years, we've created a company dedicated to collecting strictly for the staffing and recruiting industries.
Very interesting. How many offices do you have doing this?
We are based out of Atlanta, headquartered out of Atlanta, but we have, with all of our companies, we have Adams, Evans & Ross, and that's our primary company. But we have personnel that kind of float. Well, with you're over on recruiting and staffing solutions marketing side, but you do all the branding with your team for Adams, Evans & Ross, Backdoor Hires, the magazine, and things on those lines. So if you take a look at the entire business base, we're headquartered out of Atlanta, so we have an office in Atlanta. We have an office in Toronto, in New York, the UK, in Manila. And at any particular point, there's probably, we probably have about 150 attorneys that we work with on a contract basis, and then somewhere between 35 and 40 folks on our team that are floating between the companies.
Very interesting. So it seems like you've been in this industry for quite a while, longer than I've been around. What has changed since you've gotten started in the staffing and recruiting industries?
Well, that's a real neat way to say, hey, Dad, you're older than dirt. But, the biggest thing that I've seen from a vendor is the shift from a staffing side, because we have 2 separate markets. One of our markets are staffing, the other market is recruiting. So let's address staffing. With staffing, there's been a shift in the last 30 years to where temporary jobs were kind of something that you did when you first started getting started, or if you lost your job, and it was kind of a transition period. I have found that, especially with the generation, you're kind of at the bottom end of that generation, but the front end of your generation, you guys love flexibility. And so you get the best of both worlds, to where you almost come together on projects. And so working temporary is a way to that we've seen as a way to kind of transcend into full time if that's what you wanted to go. But also, we've noticed over on the recruiting or on the staffing side that the way that people use staffing has greatly changed. It used to be if somebody didn't show up, in an office, I'm kind of giving, a very basic whatever, you would go get a temporary to kind of answer the phones or to help with data or, things along those lines. With the locum tenens, if you had doctors going on vacation, you'd have a doctor kind of come in. And it became a way to almost stopgap or just fill in wherever there was a deficit. If you had people out or if there was a surge, you would staff to that surge. Over the years, the balances, in the early 90s, our average balances for collections were about $5,000 or $6,000 for a temporary firm. They're now about $27,000 for a temporary firm, and where we would go maybe once a year have a six-figure account in for collections, we now see 3 to 5 six-figure accounts a month. Oh, wow. Some of that is because we do a better job at marketing, but it's also manufacturing facilities and companies in general have outsourced their employees to temporary firms as a general rule. And that's something that from a vendor looking in on the staffing industry is not something that we saw a lot of in the 90s. It just kind of transitioned to where it's more of the natural state. In recruiting, what we have seen is it kind of fluctuates. Right now, as we do this interview in 2019, we're at like a 3.6% unemployment rate. In my career, in my my adult life of working, I've never seen a 3.6% unemployment rate. Typically, the articles that I've read is you have a statistical unemployment rate at about 4.2. So we're below at a 3.7. So the talent issue becomes a bigger issue. One of the biggest differences that I've seen in the recruiting industry is the flagrant backdoor hires. And I'm not so sure that it hasn't happened in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and maybe just technology is at a point where it catches it better. But like with our backdoor hire project or with our software, we've located $20 million in the last 3 years of placement fees globally. That is something that years ago would have been impossible to have done. And so the technology for the recruiting, as I've watched as a vendor, when the job boards, the monsters and all of those came out in the 80s or in the 90s, everybody goes, oh, no, there goes the recruiter. LinkedIn came out in the or mid 2000s. Everybody says, oh, they're not going to need for recruiting. They became tools that actually made recruiters more successful. So the thing that I've noticed with recruiters is how they've used the technology to amplify themselves and amplify their earnings.
Very interesting. So I have 5 questions that are just a little bit more fun, that are just your success secrets. So the first one is, what's your next big move? Like what's brewing, so to speak?
Well, what we're doing here and trying to position ourselves, all of it's going to be in the staffing industry. But as we expand over the years, we've acquired some other vendor companies, and that's still on the tap. So kind of go a little bit into the acquisition mode. Over on the BDH side, we bought a competitor. We've kind of expanded our offerings by either creating or buying other companies to offer to our client base, because we're extremely fortunate. We have 3,000 clients, which is roughly about 25% of the industry for staffing and recruiting use us. I'd like to get that up to where we're at 50%. But the U.S., Canada, and the UK are our major markets. And so we're just going to broaden those products that we can sell and just get better at what we're doing on the other aspect. That's why we've built the backdoor hire that's finding tons of excess cash. We brought you on board to where you can help our staffing and recruiting clients increase their sales. we brought Samantha on board as our attorney to just give yet another layer of defense on those receivables that we're going after collecting.
Very cool. Do you have a favorite business book that you would suggest to the people listening?
You know, I have a couple of them. I'm a continuous learner, so I'm always listening or watching. You know, Jay Abraham is one of my favorites. Brendan Burchard's another one. But if I have to go back to the one that probably changed how I viewed things, I have two books. One's Rich Dad Poor Dad, which is more philosophical than actual tactics, more strategic than tactics. One of them, though, that changed my business life was going to be The E-Myth by Gerber. And it basically talks about if you have problems in your company, it's not people related, it's systems related. And if you had better systems, you would consistently get better results. And it's, you know, the old franchise. You know, if you take a look at businesses that go out of business, 80% of the businesses that are non-franchise will be out of business in the first 5 years. Franchises, it's almost reverse. You know, 80% of them will survive that 5 years. And it's by having systems.
And then do you have a favorite trainer or mentor that you look up to?
You know, I've been insanely fortunate with the magazine. We came in contact 14, 15 years ago with probably one of my idols, and that was with Jay Abraham. And Jay Abraham probably has more to do with my success than anything else. Another one, and I met through Jay Abraham, was Gordon Bazar. And Gordon Bazar is kind of one of these leverage buyout guys that in the 80s was when leverage buyouts were huge. He developed a system for doing that with small businesses. And actually, if anybody sends Allie an email at allie@elotglobal.com, remind me, Allie, somewhere around here, I've interviewed Jay Abrahams Jay Abrahams and Gordon Bazar, and also Tom Hopkins, which was a sales trainer, where I had interviewed him for the magazine 20 some odd years ago or 15 years ago. We'll make those audios available. But Jay Abrahams, hands down, and Gordon Bazar is a very close second.
And then my last question is, what would you tell your 25-year-old self? So like when you were just getting started, just getting your feet wet, what would you go back and tell yourself?
You know, in my opinion, and I've been fortunate enough to work in the U.S., in Canada, in the U.K., and I love all of those markets. You know, I'm a U.S. national, so my allegiance is going to be to the U.S. But it's also the way that we do business here in the U.S. To me, our secret sauce is your perfect example. In the UK, if you run a company in the UK and that company fails, goes out of business, and if a company fails and goes out of business, there's unpaid bills. And this is coming from a debt collector. I've seen tons of companies come through here. They were good folks. They just misjudged cash flow. But if they crash that business, then they can turn around. There's nothing that stops them legally from turning around, opening up another company, and starting all over again. Now, there are some people that are going to naturally take advantage of that to where they're just going out, opening up a company, stealing, shutting it down, doing that. But that's the exception. Typically, it's because somebody didn't have the skill set. Here in the U.S., the average successful business owner, his third business is the one that he hits a home run on. And I had businesses in my early 20s that didn't work out. I had one that worked out okay. I owned jewelry stores way before you, and it served its purpose, but it wasn't a home run. But that experience I learned from. In the state or in the UK, for example, if you have a company that shuts down, you are forbidden, and it's like for 10 years to open up another company. And so, in my opinion, the secret sauce to the U.S. is that we're allowed to fail. And entrepreneurs, there's not an entrepreneur out there, even if your business doesn't just absolutely crash and burn, But if you have a big failure, a lot of times if you talk to any entrepreneur, at least with the ones that I've talked to or interviewed, if they've had insane success, it's typically links back to one spectacular failure. And it's, I had this happen, but I really learned from it. During, the crash of 2008, we lost $1 gazillion, whatever that story is. And they take that, I think it was Facebook when they were building it, one of their captions or one of their quotes was fail forward fast. And you almost have to embrace failure because that is part of the process. And so what I would, in a very long-winded way, but I am that passionate, and I know you girls have heard me say the same thing, don't do something because you're scared that it will fail. You're gonna have things that you try that don't work out, and that's part of the process. Learn from it, adapt. So I would tell myself at 25, don't feel failure so much. You're going to have ups, you're going to have downs. That's life. You're only a failure if you have ups and downs and you don't learn from them. Now you could be retarded or brain dead if you continue to make the same mistakes over and over. There's no excuse to that. But if you have an issue that where something works out, one of the biggest lessons that I learned in 2008 was we owned a lot of real estate. I still own some real estate, but we were so disproportionate in the real estate with the leverage, and even with business where we leverage, to where one of the things after we survived it, company flourished, very shortly after it. And we actually had some pretty decent years during the recession, but there were some things didn't work as well as they should have. And we're a better business now because I looked at it and says, you know what, had the ball bounced in different directions, we could have gotten caught up very badly in some of that slowdown. So I don't practice leverage, at least financial leverage, the way that we used to as much, because I also realized that we survived it. We did well, put you guys through college during all that period of time. But had the ball bounced slightly different, we would have been caught up in that a lot more. So we focus more on generating profits long-term, but also in the now. And so that's where we have good systems. So we know how much the magazine's supposed to generate, how much Adams, Evans, and Ross is supposed to generate. But in a long-winded way, don't be afraid of failure. Almost embrace failure as part of the process.
Well, that's so interesting. Thank you so much for your time. I feel like I've learned a lot, even though I grew up hearing a lot of this stories. So it was just cool hearing it in a different light. Well,
outstanding. Well, thank you, Allie. Good interview on that. And we'll see everybody here next Monday. Now, with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up this particular interview. This interview, you're going to see a couple of different ways because we wanted you to kind of see behind the process. And if you take a look somewhere here on the YouTube channel, if it's more than a month or so after when this one was posted, you're going to see the actual interview where it all comes together. If you take a look at the magazine or you take a look at some of our written article, you're going to see where we pull this information from there. And if you're in staffing, if you're a vendor in staffing, if you're a staffing or recruiting firm, we want to interview you as well. It's absolutely 100% free to you, and it's just our way of giving back to the industry, but it's also our way of getting content to where you can share stories with the industry, and hopefully the industry, when everybody kind of shares their peaks and their valleys, I think the industry itself becomes more stable. Well, Allie, I appreciate you joining me for this, and I will see you next week on Monday Morning Memo. Everybody, if you would like to reach out to Allie, either to get a copy of those interviews I did 15, 20 years ago with Jay Abraham, Tom Hopkins, or Gordon Bazar, email Allie at elocglobal.com. and she'll get you fixed up on that. Also, if you'd like to set up a time for Allie to interview you for our YouTube channel or for the magazine, please reach out to her and she'll get that set up as well. Have a good week, Al.
Awesome.